Hey Vision Chasers, it's Dr. Bird here with the social studies lesson for you today. By the mid-1870s, many Northerners simply lost interest in Reconstruction, and they were no longer willing to go all out to fight for the rights of African Americans. And also at risk was their protection, their physical protection as well. Because with the Compromise of 1877, the federal troops were removed from the South, leaving these African Americans vulnerable to whatever treatment the new Southern governments decided to give to these newly freed slaves and now citizens. And those who were in charge of these new state governments in the South were the same people who were in charge before the war. And obviously they were also former slave owners as well, and they were very resentful about how things went down and the fact that their former slaves are now citizens, and as citizens they have rights, and one of the rights that they have is the right to vote. And so these former slave owners who are now empowered, they would do all they could in order to prevent African Americans from voting. Because again, the ability to vote, that changes things. So obviously these newly freed slaves and now they're citizens, they're not going to vote for the same people who were oppressing them before. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about the things that were done in the South to prevent African Americans from voting. So the initial response of many of these former slave owners and people who were frustrated because of the result of the Civil War and members of the Democrat Party, their initial reaction was to resort to violence, and so the Ku Klux Klan was born, and they specialized in intimidation towards any African American wanting to vote or anyone who agreed with Reconstruction. Additionally, the Democrats in the South would turn to literacy tests, because after all, former slaves were not allowed to obtain an education when they were slaves. So the Democrats come up with this test in order to prevent freedmen and in many cases poor white citizens from voting. And in many cases, this test revolved around the Constitution. And if any of you have seen Selma, there is a scene at the beginning of that movie that illustrates how one of these literacy tests would have gone down. Initially, the African-American woman played by Oprah Winfrey was doing a great job on the test until the person giving her the test totally changed the rules so that she could not pass and therefore she could not vote. Additionally, many of these former slaves had little to no money at all. And so the Democrats in the South came up with a plan called a poll tax to require citizens to pay a fee in order to register to vote. Now, obviously, poor African Americans could not pay this tax, and that prevented them from voting. And these laws were very, very, very effective. In my research, I found that, for example, in Mississippi in the year 1890, there were 147,000 African Americans who were able to vote, but only about 9,000 of them were actually registered to vote. In Louisiana in the year 1896, there were 130,000 registered African American voters. But by 1904, that number dropped to 1,342. Now, lastly, the Democrats came up with a plan to allow those white citizens that they wanted to vote without any obstruction by the literacy test or the poll tax. Now, this plan was called the Grandfather Clause. And the Grandfather Clause would go even further to silence the voice of the African Americans living in the South, because the overwhelming majority of these Democrats in the South agreed with the treatment that African Americans in the South were subjected to. So basically, the Grandfather Clause stated that if you were registered to vote or someone in your family were registered to vote prior to the Civil War, then you'd be exempt from all of these new requirements to vote, such as a literacy test and the poll tax. So ultimately, Reconstruction was a failure because it failed to protect freedmen and 100% secure their rights and privileges as citizens of the United States. And so they were vulnerable to their former slave owners. Well, that is our social studies lesson for the day. I know that was a kind of a downer, but again, we give you the history, you make up your mind. We know kind of the rest of the story with that. It would be almost about 100 years later until things really start to change with the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s. And so those literacy tests are outlawed, the poll taxes are outlawed. And so things move very, very slowly over time, and definitely there are people out there who would make the argument that we're still trying to fight against some of those injustices. But again, I present that to you, and you do with it what you want. So please feel free to download the worksheet that goes along with this video to further your knowledge of what happened to the freedmen after Reconstruction in regards to their voting rights. So thanks again for watching, and until we meet again, please keep chasing the vision. Bye.